Have you ever noticed how calling a place ugly always leads to confusion? On the one hand, there are those who defend it tooth and nail, and on the other, those who agree with it without blinking. At the end of the day, beauty is subjective, and as the wise saying goes, it's in the eye of the beholder. But let's be honest, some places really don't work. Whether it's a lack of planning, poor infrastructure, or a touch of neglect, there are destinations that challenge the boundaries between beauty and ugliness, creating scenarios that divide opinion. That's why today, Bello Mundo takes you on a tour of the 10 ugliest countries in Latin America. But calm down. Before you start swearing in the comments, nobody here is saying that these places don't have culture, history, or incredible people. This list takes into account aspects such as urbanism, conservation and infrastructure, journalistic reports and testimonials from locals and tourists. There's nothing to stop you going there, falling in love with the food, the hospitality, or some breathtaking scenery, and ending up totally disagreeing with our selection. Agreed? Now that the warning has been given, let's embark on this journey through the most questionable countries in terms of beauty. Number 10. Suriname. Opening our list is a country that few people know about or even think about visiting. Suriname. Tucked away in the northern corner of South America, it often goes under the radar of tourists. And when someone decides to explore, they end up with a stark contrast between the natural wealth and the lack of urban structure. On the bright side, Suriname has an absurd biodiversity. Its tropical forests are home to rare species such as jaguars, multicolored macaws, and even pink dolphins. The Central Suriname Nature Reserve, for example, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a paradise for ecotourism lovers. In addition, the country's culture is one of the most unique in Latin America, mixing indigenous, Indian, Javanese, African, and even Chinese influences. All this is reflected in the cuisine, which can be one of the most surprising experiences of the trip. But here comes the problem. When you leave the middle of the jungle and set foot in the city, the magic ends quickly. The capital, Paramaribo, even has a UNESCO-recognized historic center, but no one seems to care much about it. Crumbling colonial buildings, bumpy sidewalks, and traffic that doesn't seem to follow any rules mean that the charm of the past is buried in the chaos of the present. What's more, the country's infrastructure leaves something to be desired. Public transportation is precarious, tourist services are limited, and, in many places, there is a feeling of abandonment. The potential is there, but until there is a real effort to improve urban organization and preserve heritage, Suriname will remain an unattractive destination for those seeking a more structured tourist experience. Number 9. Honduras. Moving on, we arrive in Honduras, and here the controversy begins. If you ask anyone who has visited Honduras, the answer can range from paradise to absolute chaos. And the truth, it depends a lot on where you are. Let's start with the good. The beaches of Roatan and the Bay Islands are jaw-dropping. Crystal clear water, white sand, postcard-worthy coral reefs. And it doesn't stop there. The country has spectacular forest reserves and impressive Mayan ruins, such as those at Copan. When it comes to its cities, however, the story changes. The capital, Tegucigalpa, for example, looks like a jigsaw puzzle put together without much thought. Unplanned buildings, chaotic traffic, pollution, precarious public transportation, and an urban appearance that looks more like a pile of concrete without any charm. Anyone who walks around there complains about the disorder, the dirt, and the constant feeling of insecurity. And with good reason. Honduras has one of the highest crime rates in Latin America, with gangs controlling certain areas and making the atmosphere even heavier. And the situation doesn't get much better in the country's other big cities. Many of the working-class neighborhoods suffer from irregular waste disposal, poor infrastructure, and an aesthetic that screams abandonment. The contrast between the paradisiacal resorts and the urban reality is enormous, so Honduras ends up being a country with incredible natural beauty, but which loses a lot of points when it comes to organization and urban appearance. It's the typical place where you choose very carefully where you go, because depending on the destination, it can seem like you're visiting two completely different countries. Number 8. El Salvador. Small on the map, but full of contrasts, El Salvador is a country that divides opinion. It has beaches disputed by surfers from all over the world, imposing volcanoes, and a cuisine that makes anyone want to repeat the dish. But when it comes to its cities, the story is not so pretty. The capital, San Salvador, has been trying to modernize, especially now that it has gained the international spotlight due to its stricter security policies. In fact, there are reports that the city is more organized and less violent than before, but it still has a long way to go to become a visually pleasing destination. The electricity wires look like a spider's web hanging everywhere. The asphalt is a roller coaster of potholes and patches, and old buildings are in a state that oscillates between historic and in urgent need of repair. In addition, uncontrolled deforestation over the decades has left many areas looking dry and barren. Where once there were dense forests covering large areas, today the scene is one of battered mountains and little vegetation. Is it all bad? Of course not. El Salvador also has its charms. The beaches are a surfer's paradise, and the cuisine, with its iconic pupusas, is one of the country's highlights. In addition, there are revitalization projects in some historic areas. Whether they work out or not, only time will tell. But for now, the country remains a destination that oscillates between the spectacular and the careless. Number 7. Paraguay. The truth is that Paraguay has a strong cultural identity, but suffers from a lack of international recognition. While its neighbors boast paradisiacal beaches or cinematic mountains, Paraguay has a more discreet look, and its cities are not usually described as the most beautiful in South America. The capital, Asunción, even has charming historic buildings, but they share space with modern constructions that seem to have been built without much planning. The traffic is chaotic, the sidewalks are a challenge for any pedestrian, and entire neighborhoods suffer from frequent flooding. Not to mention the infrastructure, which has long been in need of investment. And why did the country get this way? The answer lies in a gigantic historical trauma. The Paraguayan War, fought against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay in the 19th century. The conflict practically destroyed the nation, leaving a trail of poverty and instability that echoes to this day. To make matters worse, even after the end of the war, Paraguay was forced to pay a debt to Brazil until 1943, when it was finally forgiven. In other words, as well as being devastated militarily, it still had to carry this economic burden for almost a century. And as if that wasn't enough, decades later came another problem: the Chaco War against Bolivia. The result? The country went from one historical disaster to another, always trying to get back on its feet, with few resources. But it's not all tragedy. Paraguay may not have a coastline, but it does have welcoming people, a fascinating culture, and an authenticity that is lacking in many tourist destinations. The Guarani language is still widely spoken, the cuisine has its surprises, and those who stray from the obvious can find some very interesting regions to explore. Number 6. Nicaragua. We come to Nicaragua, a country famous for its volcanoes and lakes, but also for political conflicts that have left their mark on the urban landscape. Managua, the capital, is not exactly a place that stands out for its architectural beauty. Rebuilt after a major earthquake in 1972, the city has developed in a messy way, without a defined center, which means that many visitors get lost in the layout of the streets. The lack of investment in urban planning also weighs heavily. Unmaintained streets, a buildup of garbage in some places, and buildings that seem to have been abandoned before they were even completed are a common sight. To make matters worse, recent political instability has not helped matters, leaving public infrastructure even more outdated. But if you ignore the urban look and go for nature, then Nicaragua really does impress. The Ometepe Islands, formed by two volcanoes in the middle of a gigantic lake, are a spectacle in themselves. The Pacific beaches are also gaining fame among surfers and can be a good alternative for those looking for a cheaper and less crowded destination than neighboring Costa Rica. In other words, if you go to Nicaragua, don't expect beautiful, organized cities. But if you want authentic contact with nature and a country with a strong indigenous and Spanish influence, it may be worth exploring. Number 5. Bolivia. Leaving Nicaragua, we now come to Bolivia, a real clash of contrasts. On the one hand, it has some of the most surreal landscapes on the planet, such as the Salar de Uyuni, a salt desert that looks like a giant mirror reflecting the sky. On the other, there are cities that, for many visitors, aren't exactly eye-catching. La Paz, for example, is visually impressive, but not in the conventional sense of beauty. The city sprawls over the hills, full of exposed brick buildings that seem to grow without much logic. Neighboring El Alto, which is even higher, takes this scenery to the extreme. A sea of unfinished buildings, dirt streets, and a dry climate that makes everything seem shrouded in eternal dust. And that's not all. The chaotic traffic, the pollution, and the extreme altitude, which makes even the most prepared breathless, all contribute to a challenging urban experience in Bolivia. Obviously, not everything is gray, as you can imagine. Bolivian culture is vibrant, full of colors and traditions that make the country unique. Street markets sell everything from typical food to shaman's potions. The women dressed in the iconic round skirts, known as cholas pacheñas, add a touch of authenticity that few places in the world have. Not to mention that, outside the big cities, Bolivia's natural landscapes are jaw-dropping. Number 4. Cuba. Coming in at number 4 is the controversial Cuba. It always divides opinion. There are those who visit the island and are enchanted by the colonial architecture, the colorful old cars, the music pulsing around every corner, and that retro vibe that seems straight out of a postcard. But there are also those who come back shocked by the crumbling buildings, bumpy streets, and an air of abandonment that affects many of the less touristy areas. The problem is that, after decades of economic embargo and lack of investment in infrastructure, many Cuban cities seem stuck in time, and not in a romantic way. Havana, for example, was once one of the Caribbean's most vibrant capitals, but today it displays peeling facades, buildings on the verge of collapse, and entire neighborhoods without any maintenance. The situation is even worse in poorer regions, where access to basic supplies such as building materials is extremely limited. But if the urban setting disappoints, Cuba's natural surroundings make up for it. Beaches like Varadero have one of the bluest seas in the Caribbean, and the interior of the country is home to lush landscapes with untouched mountains and valleys. Number 3. Guatemala. Coming up to our top 3, next destination, Guatemala. Called the country of eternal spring because of the pleasant climate in many regions, it also boasts incredible Mayan landscapes, such as Tikal, and active volcanoes that beautify, and sometimes frighten, the horizon. So why is it on our list of ugly countries? Well, largely because of Guatemala City, the capital which, for many visitors, is synonymous with a messy and sloppy urban look. Decades of corruption, lack of investment, and uncontrolled expansion have caused the city to grow irregularly. Old buildings, unpainted facades, dirty streets, and dangerous neighborhoods are among the main complaints of those who pass through. It gives the feeling that no one has bothered to create a coherent plan, and in fact, many prefer to use Guatemala City only as a gateway, going straight to more beautiful places, such as Antigua, Guatemala, or Lake Atitlan. On the other hand, the capital does have some more modern areas, with shopping malls and luxury buildings. But, as is the case in many Latin American metropolises, the inequality is stark. Rich neighborhoods on one side and precarious outskirts on the other, which don't seem to receive the slightest attention from the government. But if the capital disappoints, the country's indigenous traditions, craft fairs, and historical sites make up for any initial stress. Just a few hours by car or bus, and you'll find postcard scenery. Number 2. Venezuela. If it were a few decades ago, Venezuela would probably not appear on this list. With large oil reserves, modern cities, and breathtaking natural landscapes, such as the Angel Falls, the largest waterfall in the world, the country was once a reference point for prosperity in the region. The political and economic crisis has devastated the country, and Caracas, once synonymous with sophistication, is now a city marked by abandonment. Bumpy streets, buildings that seem to be crumbling for so long without maintenance, chaotic traffic, and precariously functioning basic services are some of the problems faced by residents. The water and energy supply is unstable, and urban violence has become a constant concern. Many Venezuelans are even trying to leave the country in search of better living conditions, and this exodus has contributed to the deterioration of several once well-kept areas. Even prime areas have lost their luster with the closure of establishments and the lack of investment. Despite this, there's no denying that Venezuelan nature is a spectacle in its own right. Los Roques, for example, is a paradisiacal archipelago with crystal-clear seas and white sand, a true paradise for those who enjoy diving and tranquility. Inland, there are mountains, savannas, and tropical forests full of wildlife. In short, Venezuela is the country of great contrast, heart-rending cities versus breathtaking natural beauty. Number 1. Haiti. Coming to the end of our trip and topping our ranking is Haiti, a country that unfortunately carries the title of the poorest in the Americas and has been facing a succession of political, economic, and environmental crises for decades. The capital, Port-au-Prince, has never been an example of impeccable urbanism, but after the devastating earthquake of 2010, the city took on an even more critical appearance. Many buildings have never been rebuilt, rubble can still be seen in many parts, and basic infrastructure is practically non-existent in some areas. Sanitation is a huge problem. With no regular garbage collection and no efficient sewage system, many streets are overrun with waste and exude a strong smell of open sewage. Rampant deforestation has also left much of the country arid and vulnerable to landslides and floods. The situation is only made worse by political instability and the presence of armed gangs who dominate certain territories, making life even more difficult for the population and ruling out any prospect of recovery in the short term. Even so, Haiti has a very rich culture, marked by African and European traditions that are manifested in music, crafts, and religion. The resilience of the Haitian people is also often praised. Even in the face of so much difficulty, people find ways to move on, promoting artistic and cultural initiatives that surprise even the most attentive visitors. And so we come to the end of our ranking of the countries considered to be the ugliest in Latin America. Now tell me, do you agree with the ranking? Have you ever visited one of these countries and had a completely different experience to the one described here? Do you know people who live or have lived in one of these places and can give you a different perspective? Leave a comment and let's have a chat. If you enjoyed this content and want to see more lists, rankings, and curiosities about our Bello Mundo, don't forget to like, share, and follow. Thank you very much for your company and see you next time.